Welcome to Friday's edition of Renew Plus. I'm Pastor Tony. Thank you for joining us here at the end of week number 7 of our series, Our New Identity. And I tell you, we really, I believe, hit the heart of this whole message right here this week, and we'll continue into next week as well. But we got a few things to say here at the end of week number 7. I want to go back over to the book of Romans today, book of Romans chapter 4 this time. Remember, we were in Romans 10 yesterday, and we were pointing out the two kinds of righteousness. First of all, self-righteousness, the righteousness that we get basically as a lone ranger trying to use the law, use religion, dead works of religion to try to earn and achieve a righteousness acceptable to God. And I'll tell you right now, that is never going to work. It might give you a brief relief, but that's about all. Because let me tell you something, you're always still going to have that sin consciousness present on the inside of you. You're going to be lacking in confidence, lacking in boldness in approaching God. You're always going to come, bombarding the gates of heaven as a beggar, as an outsider, rather than approaching God on the basis of His righteousness that He's given us as a free gift, and coming boldly to the throne of grace to obtain mercy and find grace to help in a time of need. And I tell you, His righteousness is perfect. Our righteousness, it's not anywhere close to being perfect, okay? It is full of holes. It's like Swiss cheese, all right? So we don't want to go that route. You can go one route or another. You're going to go one route or another, I can tell you. Because inbred in every one of us, in our hearts, is that idea that we have to justify ourselves. Well, your self-righteous works will never satisfy that longing inside of you. It's only the revelation that God gave us, His righteousness in the new birth as a free gift by grace, that will satisfy and uproot and eradicate and eliminate that guilty condemnation, shame, inferiority, sin consciousness that's kind of inbred in all of us. That's the only answer to it right there, is receiving the righteousness of God as a free gift. Now here in Romans chapter 4, he's answering the question from verse number 1. He said, "What then shall we say that Abraham our father has found according to the flesh?" In other words, what did he find out that made a big difference in his life? Well, we talked about this before, and we've used Abraham as an example, as the new covenant does quite often, because this is what he found out. He found out, had a revelation, that God would treat him righteous if he just believed Him and trusted in Him. In other words, we could say, we believe in Jesus, we receive Jesus, and God makes us righteous, and not just put in our account as someday going to happen, but we are made the righteousness of God the moment we're made a new creation in Christ. But what did Abraham find out? Even though you're made a new creation, even though you are the righteousness of God in Christ, the moment you make Jesus the Lord of your life, that doesn't mean that you have a revelation of who you are and what you have in Him. That doesn't mean you're walking in the light of it. That's why we're talking about what we're doing right now. Because you have to, just like Abraham, you're going to have some things revealed to you. You're going to have to find out some stuff. What did he find out? What he found out that he was justified by faith. And he found out that justification by faith all came through the avenue of God's grace. That it was grace and not works. See, grace and the grace of God and man-made works are completely opposite. Man-made works are all about self-righteousness. The grace of God is always going to lead you to the righteousness of God to be received as a free gift. And that's the only one that's going to be acceptable. But look at verse 4 and 5. That's where really what I want to get to. It says in verse 4, "Now to him who works." That's not what we want to do. What does it mean working? That's not your 9-to-5 job he's talking about. He's talking about right here, him who works is the one who is trying to keep the deeds of the law or religious rituals and traditions in order to produce their own righteousness, as we talked about. So it says, "Now to him who works, the wages are not counted as grace, but as debt." In other words, if you're going to go that route, if you're going to go the route of self-righteous works, trying to work and earn and achieve righteousness, acceptability to God, being right with Him, being in right standing with Him through your works, then it's not going to be grace. It's going to be counted as debt. In other words, your works are never going to get it done. In fact, you're going to get a paycheck after all your works are said and done And because of all that sin debt from the first Adam all the way through to your stuff, your wages have been garnished to the point you still, not only are you not getting a paycheck, your debt has accrued even more interest. It's just a self-defeating philosophy, a mindset, and a way of life. You're never going to get there that way. So it says, now to him who works, trust in their own righteous self-efforts to try to attain righteousness with God, it's not counted as grace, but as debt. We don't want that. No, the only thing that's going to pay the sin debt off, to clear our account out, was the finished work of Jesus. Not your works, but the finished work of Jesus. The only thing that's going to produce a righteousness acceptable to God is by believing in Jesus through the avenue of grace. So look at verse number 5. It says, but to him who does not work, again, not 9-to-5 job, he's talking about working, righteous works to try to achieve righteousness with God, right standing with God. But to him who does not work, but believes on him who justifies the ungodly. I want you to see that God justifies the who? The ungodly. See, this is what Abraham found out. You have to understand, before, when he was in Ur of the Chaldees, Abram, Ur of the Chaldees, before he came in covenant with God, before he believed God, he was ungodly like you and me. So notice, he found this out. He says, but believes on him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is accounted for righteousness. See, how in the world could God justify or declare righteous an ungodly person? Someone who doesn't deserve it. Well, again, enter the grace of God, the abundant, overflowing grace of God. That's the only avenue of which the ungodly, the unrighteous can receive righteousness, right standing with God, on the basis that what we're talking about right here, where you can come boldly and confidently into the throne of grace without any sense of condemnation, guilt, or shame, or inferiority, just as if sin never existed. The only way you can go that route is through grace. If you try to achieve that through works, never going to get there. Never happen. It's just going to accrue more debt to your account. But notice, the grace of God not only pays our debt off, but it goes far beyond that and gives us a seat at God's own right hand. Now, go over one chapter to chapter 5. Remember yesterday, the end of the day, we were talking about the two primary things, not the only things, but the two primary things that new covenant believers are to be established in. First of all, the grace of God from Hebrews chapter 13, I believe it is, and then Isaiah 54, 13 and 14, prophesying about new covenant day of which we're living in, that we're to be established in righteousness. So those two things, grace and righteousness, we need to be established in. Not just kind of acquainted with or knowledgeable about to some degree intellectually, but we need to be established. In other words, it needs to get down in our heart and begin to renovate our perspective, our in-look, our outlook, how we view life, how we view ourselves, God, everything. That means our hearts are becoming established in those two things right there. That's the key, really, that opens the door for us to be able to walk in the light of and receive the blessing of God in our life. To be able to approach God and receive grace in a time of need, answer prayer, victory in life, authority of the believer. All these other things right here, our inheritance, all those are attached to those two things, and our heart needs to be established in it. Well, see, this is what Abraham found out that made a big difference in his life. He went from seeing himself childless to accepting his new identity as Abraham, being the father of a multitude, because of grace and righteousness. He saw those two things. So notice here in Romans chapter 5, verse 17, it says, for if by the one man's offense death reigned through the one, much more. Now, who's the one man he's talking about? The first Adam, as we looked at. For if by the one man, Adam, his offense, death reigned through the one, much more those who receive. And he's talking born-again believers. Those who receive the abundance of grace and of the free gift of righteousness will reign in life through the one Jesus Christ. Notice that right there. Much more, first of all. In other words, what Satan was able to do through sin in the first Adam, and in mankind because of that, there's a disproportional amount of grace that God poured out upon us through the free gift of his son Jesus. And then when we receive this, you have to receive it. He's talking to believers here. This is already a reality to a born-again believer in your spirit. You're already, because of a work of grace, you are made the righteousness of God, a new creation in him. But you have to go on and receive that. You can't receive something you don't know anything about. It's not been revealed to you. But then you come on to the place of receiving, taking possession of, taking ownership of the abundance of grace and of the free gift of righteousness. Notice what the effect of that is. We will reign in life through the one Jesus Christ. We will reign as kings in life, as one translation says. See, that's what God's plan is and purpose is for all of us. That doesn't mean we rule over people. That's not what he's talking about. We're ruling and reigning in life, over the circumstances of life, over demonic forces and adversaries that try to come against us. We're ruling and reigning over the temptation of sin. All those things right there. When we receive the abundance of grace and the free gift of righteousness. That's the righteousness of God in Christ. Now, let's as we close this week, let's go to Ephesians chapter 2. Ephesians, the second chapter. Because we've been talking about what righteousness is all week. What the definition of righteousness is. I've given you what it means, what it includes to a general basis. But I believe Ephesians chapter 2 paints a picture, gives us a description of the righteousness of God in Christ. And we don't have time to read all of Ephesians 2, but it starts out talking about who we were in the first Adam in and of ourselves, and how we couldn't help ourselves. We couldn't work ourselves out of that condition. So in verse 4 it says, "But God, who is rich in mercy because of his great love, or with he has loved us." Notice, salvation, righteousness, is all God-centered. It's all an act of God. So verse number 5 says, "Even when we were," see, that's the way we used to be, "even when we were dead in trespasses, he made us alive together with Christ." He made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved. Notice he inserts that right there. By grace you have been saved. He wants us to know it's not your works. It's not anything that you did. It's the finished work of God in Christ. So again, verse 5 says, "Even when we were dead in trespasses and sins, he made us alive." God made us alive together with Christ. See, us being in Christ means that everything that Jesus did for us was put to our account, and we did it with him. So when God made, on the third day after Jesus paid the full debt of sin, on the third day God justified him in the Spirit. But you know what happened? He justified you and me in the Spirit also with him. Declared us righteous, or in right standing with himself, free of sin, forgiven, cleansed of sin. And it says that on the third day that he made him alive in the Spirit. Well, guess what? He made us alive in the Spirit also, because we're in and with Christ. But then he says he made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved. In verse 6, "And he raised us up together." Notice that's past tense. This is the way God sees us. He doesn't see us outside of Christ, separated away from him, and then one day we'll be in heaven, we'll be in Christ. No, he sees us right now. The moment you made Jesus the Lord of your life, he sees you in Christ. He sees you righteous. And listen, he sees you raised up together with Christ and made to sit together in heavenly places in Christ Jesus. Notice he raised us up together with Jesus, and he made us to sit together in heavenly places in Christ Jesus. This is a description of the righteousness of God that we have, that we possess, that we are in Christ Jesus right now, in union with him. And see, notice right here that this is past tense terminology, not something that's going to happen, not something that you're trying to achieve or become or evolve into. This is something you are already done in your spirit. You have already been made the righteousness of God, meaning you are raised up with him and made to sit together in heavenly places. Now remember, in 2 Corinthians 5:21, it says, "He who knew no sin was made to be sin for us, that we might be made the righteousness of God in Christ." Remember, on the cross, Jesus identified with us and was made to be sin for all of us. He took the sins of all the world, all the way from the first Adam, all the way through all of us, and he took that and absorbed that to himself, paid the price, paid the sin debt off, suffered under that condemning sentence once and once for all. He became sin for us. God saw him in our sin, and that's why he was punished the way he was. That's why he was condemned. That's why God turned his back on him. He was made sin. But guess what? On the third day, he was justified in the Spirit. He was made so righteous that there was no trace of that sin in him any longer. There was no trace of any sickness, disease, curse, any of that condemnation. There was no trace whatsoever of that sin condition in Jesus when he was raised up, justified, made righteous by God in the sight of God. And guess what? That is the same righteousness that we have. Remember, to identify with Jesus means that we're identical to him. Sameness and oneness. The same righteousness that we see in Jesus when God raised him from the dead and made him to sit together at God's right hand in heavenly places, far above all principality, power, might, and dominion, and every name that is named. That's the same righteousness that we have, that we possess, that we enjoy right now in him. It's not a sub-righteousness. It's not an inferior righteousness. It's not a second-rate or a economy class righteousness. It is a first-class, perfect righteousness. The same righteousness that Jesus has is ours also. Again, 1 John 4:17, as he is, so are we in this world. See, with that same righteousness that caused Jesus to be raised from the dead, that launched him into heaven, that put him in heavenly places at God's right hand, that same righteousness belongs to you and me. That is what we have right now as a free gift through the grace of God. No, we didn't earn it. We didn't deserve it. Jesus earned it and deserved it. We're getting it on his tab. We get what Jesus earns and deserves. His righteousness, given as a free gift to us, earned by him, but given as a free gift to us. And it's the same righteousness that he has. We are identical to Christ in right standing with God. And see, that's the righteousness we approach God. That's the righteousness of which we stand today. That's the righteousness on which we possess our promised land. We take the blessing of God. We bear the fruit of it. I tell you what, that is powerful right there. When you look at that right there in the light of redemption. Well, that's all the time I've got for today and this week. Join us again next week as we pick up from here. We're going to be talking about the righteousness of God, of which you have become and been made in the new creation next week again, giving you more revelation so that we become established in this in our heart and walk in the light of it, enjoy the benefits of it. Well, again, if you'd like additional materials or resources, you can always visit us on the web, tonycowan.org. Have a great weekend, and we will see you next week.